Okay, so we're going to be doing bureaucracy now. You'll recall that at some point in time, I'm sure someone has told you that there are three constitutional branches under the U.S. Constitution, those being obviously Congress, the executive branch, and the presidency. Well, in reality, the presidency and the bureaucracy, the executive branch, can be divided into those two institutions. And those two institutions, the presidency and the bureaucracy, do in fact function largely separate from one another. So we're going to take a look at the bureaucracy. Okay, first thing to talk about is the structure of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is divided into several different components, and this structure is specified by Congress. Once again, the structure of the bureaucracy is specified by Congress, not by the President, even though the President is the chief executive. The primary subdivision inside the bureaucracy is going to be something called a department. There are currently 15 major subdivisions or departments in the executive branch. These departments, again, created by Congress, and what in effect they end up being would be holding companies for different agencies. A great example would be the U.S. Department of Defense, where you have the Department of Army, Navy, and Air Force that are inside of it. Another example would be the Treasury Department, where you have the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the Internal Revenue Service, the Bureau of the Mint. So these agencies then function inside of this department. Interestingly enough, these agencies are in effect largely separate from one another. Even though they're in the same department, they do function largely separate from one another. Now, not all agencies can be put inside of a department. These agencies are called independent agencies. So they're just kind of out there. Most agencies are part of a department. Some agencies are not part of a department, and they are called independent agencies. There are three different types of these independent agencies. The first type would be what we'd call independent executive agencies. A good example of that would be the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA is an agency that is responsible for the collection of strategic information, both diplomatic and military information, and then to relay that to decision makers. Well, this agency is not part of a department. It's not part of the Department of Defense. It's not part of any military department. It's just an agency that's out there. The agency itself, the CIA, is run by a director. That director is appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. We can contrast that with other agencies inside of a department. For example, the Internal Revenue Service is run by a director appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, but that director inside the IRS is accountable to the Secretary of the Treasury, and that's because the Internal Revenue Service is inside the Treasury Department. The CIA, the director of the CIA, is not accountable to anyone other than the President because the CIA is not part of a department. Another type of executive agency would be a government corporation. A government corporation provides a service, a business-like service, and charges a fee for that service. Examples of this would be the United States Postal System and Amtrak. They charge fees, and hopefully those fees are enough to cover the cost of their operation. At least that's the theory. Those agencies are not part of the regular appropriations process. Now, in reality, those agencies frequently do not generate enough revenue to cover the cost of operation. The last type of independent executive agency is going to be an independent regulatory commission. The Independent Regulatory Commission regulates some aspect of society. Hopefully it does so in a less political manner. For purposes of this course, the most important independent agency is an independent regulatory commission, specifically the Federal Reserve. So that's the example we're going to use. The Federal Reserve is run by a group of individuals. It's not run by one person. It's run by a group. These individuals are called the Board of Governors. The people on this board have staggered terms. They are appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, but they do so in a rotating manner so that a new president will not be able to wholesale appoint a new board. Rather, he can only appoint a few individuals at a time. And it may be well into a new president's second term, if he's reelected, that he would be able to appoint a majority of the board. So this tends to insulate the decision-making process of independent regulatory commissions from a lot of the political goings-on in Washington. I want to say, I'd like to use the term insulate because it never fully removes it, but it does remove some of the pressure, but given enough heat that it'll burn through that insulation, if you'll pardon the metaphor. Another thing that should be mentioned about independent regulatory commissions and their governors or commissioners, as the case may be, is that those individuals cannot, generally speaking, be removed by the president. There's some specific instances that they could be, for example, commission of a felony, but generally speaking, they cannot be. So we have this entity or an agency that is run by a board of commissioners, not one person. Those individuals are appointed by the president on a rotational basis, so it takes a while for a new president to appoint them, and those individuals, those commissioners, or in the case of the Fed, those governors, cannot be removed by the president. So it does tend to insulate that independent regulatory commission from overt political pressure. So let's talk about the bureaucracy and special interest groups. As you recall from when we talked about special interest groups themselves, I mentioned the term iron triangle or sub-government. An iron triangle is a relationship between special interest groups, a bureaucratic agency, and congressional committees. And we'll have a chart or a diagram, we'll talk about that in just a second. So the iron triangle or sub-government is about the interplay between special interest groups, congressional committees, and bureaucratic agencies. Another metaphor that frequently is used or is increasingly used is that of an issue network. The problem with an iron triangle metaphor is that it's not fully explanatory as to how the system actually works. Now, while it does have a lot of pedagogical utility in showing the connections between those three political actors, it doesn't allow us to go beyond them. For example, can a member of the White House staff or a think tank or an academic or a media personality push policy forward? Well, of course they can. And the iron triangle metaphor really doesn't take that into account. So we use the metaphor now of an issue network. So an issue network is an alliance or a network of various political actors, including special interest groups, congressional committees, other individuals we would call policy entrepreneurs, such as high-ranking staff members, media personalities, opinion leaders, and so forth. And what they tend to do is to interact with one another and push forward a specific policy agenda. Another term that we should use with regarding bureaucracy and special interest groups is the revolving door. The revolving door is a metaphor that's used to explain how people frequently will move from one area to another. It's quite common it's somewhat common to see someone serve 20, 30 years in a federal bureaucratic agency, retire, collect a government pension, and then immediately go to work for a special interest group that lobbies that agency. This calls into question their objectivity. If you know during the last 5 years of your time in the federal workforce that at some point you're going to be looking for a job, particularly with a special interest group that you're going to have to interact with, does that mean that you're always pursuing perhaps the best policy course, or are you pursuing a policy course that's beneficial to the special interest group that you're going to go hit up for a job later on? So the revolving door represents this rotation between government service and employment by special interest groups as lobbyists. Another term we need to talk about is going to be called agency capture. Agency capture refers to a phenomenon whenever a special interest group obtains an inordinate amount of influence over a bureaucratic agency. Let's say, for example, the Veterans Administration. Well, does the Veterans Administration work for all veterans, or does the VFW, the American Legion, the Disabled American Veterans organizations, do they have an inordinate amount of influence? Are they able to dictate to that agency what it can and cannot do, what it should and should not do, and have more political influence over it than other political actors? If this is the case, then we would say that the Veterans Administration has become a captured agency. Another term is called going native. This refers to whenever a high-level bureaucrat, either an appointee by the president or a civil servant, begins to identify more with the interest that is being regulated or served than it does with the president's administration. This is particularly problematic, or particularly more likely whenever you see agencies that are in what's called the outer cabinet. Let me go ahead and define both the terms inner cabinet and outer cabinet. The inner cabinet would be the four most important cabinet departments, the four oldest cabinet departments: State, Treasury, Defense, and Justice. The outer cabinet would be all the other agencies. So, for example, the Secretary of Agriculture is not really a part of the inner cabinet, obviously, and really doesn't interact with the president that much. In theory, that person was appointed by the president to push forward the president's views on agriculture policy. But since the person, as Secretary of Agriculture, doesn't interact with the president that much, over a period of time, he becomes isolated from the president and begins to become an advocate not for the president, but rather for the Department of Agriculture and the agricultural special interest groups that are served by or regulated by the Department of Agriculture.